A Palm Ridge mother's bid to appeal her murder conviction and sentence has been postponed to February of next year. The woman, dubbed the Palm Ridge mother, murdered her partner during a domestic violence incident in 2018. She was sentenced to 10 years in the lower court in November of 2022. Now, this case, launched by the Centre for Applied Legal Studies, will serve as a precursor to a constitutional challenge which seeks to change the manner in which the court determines gender-based violence matters. Let's expand the matter with candidate legal practitioner at the Centre for Applied Legal Studies.
Good evening to you and good evening to the viewers at home. As you mentioned, this is a matter involving gender-based violence where an abused woman ended up murdering her abusive partner. And with this matter, what we are hoping to achieve is to have the law recognize that in some instances of gender-based violence, victims of violence can actually respond to the violence with violence, and that violence might end up with the partner dying in the context. And so we want our courts and our legal system to recognize that there is a phenomenon of battered woman syndrome, where a woman may respond to GBV with violence themselves as a way to protect themselves, as self-defense, and as a situation where they find themselves in a situation where it's either them or the abusive partner, because GBV matters do escalate to a point of him or me. And so we want the courts to recognize that there's a psychological impact of gender-based violence that motivates these crimes, and that they should recognize it in the sentencing regime, but also in the Criminal Amendment Act, that in mitigating factors, this must also be taken into consideration, that it's a reaction of me and him, where a woman finds themselves basically pushed in a corner where they either, are the ones who die or they defend themselves, and it's the partner, that is the consequence of abusing the woman.
Over the years, I mean, similar cases in perhaps their millions have gone through the courts. Ordinarily, what approach does the court take in a matter similar to this one?
So ordinarily, courts have actually failed to take into account gender-based violence in, convictions and sentencing, as well as in mitigating factors when they do sentence. They have actually failed to take this into consideration. In fact, what our courts have done is that they have made it, their place to decide, how a woman should react to gender-based violence, and also just how, what is reasonable for a woman in this situation in terms of reaction, in terms of the actions that they take. And so, a lot of women are in prison now in similar situations, and they are in prison because courts failed to take into account battered woman syndrome. They failed into taking into account that this was, a matter of private defense. This was a matter of him or me, and that, in many circumstances, when women react this way, it is, a reaction of last resort, and they really, at that point, have, often been failed by society. They've been failed by the police. They've been failed by the courts themselves in being protected from perpetrators. And so this has been the context with our court, that this has not been, something that's been considered, even in instances where the woman may produce, psychological evidence as to why they reacted the way they reacted. The history of abuse is not taken into account. The psychological impacts of gender-based violence are not taken into account. And so women have basically been punished by the system for taking, these steps as a matter of last resort or as a reaction due to battered woman syndrome.
Should the court rule in your favor, I mean, the matter is still ongoing, what sort of messaging do you think this case will send out to the public?
What this message will send out, I think, particularly to women who are in prison, who've been failed by the system already, and those who find themselves in gender-based violence circumstances, is that the courts are on their side, that, there is justice in the end, and that the law recognizes that, in some instances, women may find that, the abuse they are enduring, is either going to end up with them dying or, when they do react in a way that, a partner ends up dying as a result, that the law will recognize, the psychology behind that, will recognize that, there's a scourge of gender-based violence in our country, and that oftentimes women and children, constitute the large number of victims. And so what this legislation, if this case, ends up achieving the intended outcome, it will demonstrate that, the courts are actually willing to stand with women in instances of gender-based violence and also understand, why they would get to that point in their reactions. And, hopefully it may serve also as a way to just say to society that it's wrong to abuse women. And, when women find themselves in these circumstances, the courts will consider the fact that they were being abused, will consider the fact that, psychologically they've been impacted by abuse over time, and that, it will recognize that in some instances when a woman, is faced with abuse and it's at a point where it's him or her, they have a duty to defend themselves, and that private defense also applies in this situation.
Very well. Thank you so much for speaking to us about this. Let's leave the conversation there as we wrap up with candidate legal practitioner at the Center for Applied Legal Studies under Dungulu. The local economy